Hi, in this video I want to talk to you about how I go from having nothing to having something. Where do these paintings come from? How do I get from a state where I don't have any work at all, I'm out in the landscape, I'm thinking about making some paintings, and then I end up with work like this. These fairly large-scale paintings on canvas, sitting here in my studio, nicely framed, ready to go into an exhibition. How do I get from that early stage where there's nothing to where I've got something? So I have to go through a process. The paintings that I have here didn't simply appear out of nowhere. I had to start somewhere, begin by looking and finding ideas, visual ideas, and then develop those ideas into things that I want to work with and have a firm idea in my mind about where I want to go with the paintings. And I like to do that through actually doing the work. I don't spend a lot of time mulling over ideas and concepts and thinking about what these paintings should be of. What I like to do is simply be out in the landscape, doing some paintings, and then using that work to develop the ideas in a visual way when I get back to the studio. If you look at the paintings that are here, there's a lot of surface that's been built up. There's a lot of paint layers. There's all sorts of different materials on here as well. And something like this, where it's a reasonably large painting, this is a metre by 120, so it's about 4 feet high here. There's a lot of different materials and different processes that I've gone through on this surface. I've built up a lot of texture, used a lot of different types of painting techniques. Some of it will have been painted on the wall, some of it will have been painted flat. So when I'm working towards paintings like these, I have to have this process to go through, because I don't want to be in the studio and thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have some paintings which are about the sea? Because that's what these are. They're big kind of crashy wave seascape paintings. But I'm not just sitting in my studio and thinking about that and trying to maybe grab a couple of photos that I might have taken when I'm at the coast. I need to work through a process that will allow me to find out not just that really vague idea of painting of the sea, but something a little bit more specific, something that's a bit more personal, so that when I'm here in the studio, I know deep in my mind what the painting's about, so I can keep pulling myself back to that when I get lost. So I'll just give you a brief overview of where I start and how I use that earlier work to inform the paintings in the studio. I like to do a lot of painting and drawing outside to get my mind in the right place and also to generate the visual ideas that I need when I'm working in the studio. And the way that I do this is I take out large sheets of just drawing paper. And you may have seen me working on these sorts of things in previous workshops or a membership group or even on YouTube. But this is just reasonably heavyweight but not too thick drawing paper. And I take these out. These are some different paintings that I did here in the coast in the north of England. But I like to make these very gestural, energetic kind of paintings. So with these kinds of paintings, I'm not trying to make pictures. While I'm outside, I'm not even really thinking about composition. The function of these paintings is to allow me to look at where I am, to use the process of painting and drawing to force myself and to help me to really see what's in front of me. Because I really believe that the process of drawing and painting direct out in the landscape actually makes you look harder, so you see more. By doing these kinds of paintings, I'm really there in the landscape. So I really see things that I wouldn't do if I was just passing through. So over a course of a painting session, I may end up with 6 or 10 of these sorts of paintings. And I can bring those back to the studio, use them to recreate the experience of what it was like to be there, and begin to develop a visual language for the kinds of paintings that I want to produce in the studio. Following on from that, I like to bring these rough paintings back to the studio, and then I'll work on them in my sketchbooks. And this is where I begin to develop the ideas that will eventually end up as work like this. I've taken these sorts of sketches that I've done outside and reworked them into my sketchbook, finding arrangements of shapes and colours and lines and textures that really excite me. So what I thought would be quite useful is to show you some of this work, show you some of the work where it began, where I was working outside, developed it into these paintings in my sketchbook, developed it into some of the smaller paintings that I did, and used all of that work, all of that visual idea building to end up with these large-scale paintings. So I'm just going to go through the stages of the process from where I start all the way through to developing the ideas visually, developing the ideas as I go along through doing the work, to ending up with the paintings you can see around me here. For these paintings here, I was on the coast. I was right up close to the waves on the edge of the shore, making these energetic, very physical kind of paintings on those sheets of paper that I could then bring back to the studio. So you can see here in this video where I'm just using these very simple materials and quite a basic palette as well to make the work just in response to what's around me. I don't tend to take much with me. I like to keep the palette very simple, just carry a few materials, a few paints and a few drawing materials and pencils and soft pastels and things like that, just so I can travel light and not have to worry about having huge amounts of kit with me. So I'm making all these kind of very energetic marks, as you can see, and just trying to think about what's around me, putting this paint down on the surface, but not worrying too much about where it's going or where it's going to end up, what I might do with it in the future. Because I think those sorts of things are for later on. The sketching and painting I do outside has a very specific purpose, and that is to allow me to be there, to give me time to be outside in the landscape, soaking it in, getting some ideas down on the paper, certainly, and I'm going to use those later on. But in a way, the actual paintings themselves are not necessarily the main thing. I use the time that I spend doing the paintings as a way of looking and seeing and feeling what's there, so I can recreate that experience when I'm no longer wherever I am doing the painting. So that way I'm not trying to do everything at once. I feel like I can be more creative and end up with work that is less obvious and that surprises me, and that surprise, that unexpected quality of the work, that when I begin it, I don't know where it's going to end up. It's one of the things I find most exciting. The next stage of the process is where I bring all this raw material back to the studio and try and rearrange it into a state in my sketchbook where I'm beginning to think about how it's all going to fit together. And also at this point, I'm starting to think about what it was exactly that I was enjoying about being there. So there's definitely a series of steps to this process. Now I have these pieces of work in my sketchbook. They started outside, I've brought them back, I've done things with them, so they've ended up here in my sketchbook. Now I can start to look through them and see where the common ideas are. I can start to use them to build up a series of interesting visual ideas. It's at this point where I can start to think about doing some work maybe on different surfaces. Now, I don't think of the work in my sketchbooks as any less interesting or less important than pieces of work that are on board or on canvas. It's all the same thing to me. So I think that's something that you should think about while you're doing your work. It's not to think of one type of work or one particular surface or size of piece of work as more important than any other. It's all about trying to communicate your ideas, and if that is best communicated in a small sketch, then that's great. And if it's best communicated on a large canvas, then that's just as great. But the one is not more important than the other. It's how do you best communicate what you're trying to put across. But I like working on all sorts of different surfaces. The painting outside on sheets of paper, I find that enormously enjoyable. And then bringing those back to the studio and cropping them and collaging them, that's great fun as well. But I love working on these little gesso panels and the big canvases. They all have different characteristics. And like I was saying, they can all communicate what I'm trying to say, but in slightly different ways. As we go through the course, I'd like you to think of all the work we do as a single body of work. Each painting is just a facet of the same idea. No one painting has to carry all the weight. That way you'll find the whole process more relaxed, more creative, and a lot more fun.